History is a difficult subject. Practically everyone who specialises in other subjects will say, what a daft thing to say, or what an appalling, banal thing to say. It's just a truism. Because my subject's difficult as well. I'm a physicist, or I'm a medical doctor. If you think history is difficult, let me tell you about mine. Okay, but let me then, perhaps more intelligently, try and detail in what way history is a difficult subject. If you are a medical doctor, a surgeon performing an operation on someone's chest, for example, or a medical researcher discovering new things about cancer cells, circulation of the blood, your own political and social views and scale of values need not enter in. Sometimes they do, but strictly speaking, they need not. Whether the surgeon operating on you is a Trotskyist or a rather right-wing Tory, it doesn't matter as long as he's a conscientious medical man. His competence can be divorced from his political views. In the same way, if I look out of the window and see a paving stone in the garden, that can be analysed and examined by a geologist or a chemist without really his own political views or his interests getting in the way. The problem with history is you have a researcher, an academic, whatever, historian, who is a human being at one point in historical time, examining the activities of a bunch of fellow human beings at another point in historical time. So, I'll come back to this later. You have a young Marxist historian in the 1930s, like Christopher Hill, who's still alive at the time I'm speaking, now an old gentleman, later Master of Balliol. He was in the 1930s examining and looking at the 1630s, the prelude to the Civil War in England. And he is a man of immense brilliance and ability and scholarship. But the way he did it is not the way we would do it now, 60 years later, nearly 70 years later, in fact. So it's very hard, however much you try, to divorce the moral values, the sheer interests and conceptions, sheer assumptions of your own time from the period you're studying. In fact, one of the besetting sins of historians, which I always labour to bunches of students, is anachronism. Let's examine this word. It just means Greek ana, out of chronos, time, so out of time. And the less interesting definition of anachronism means out of time in an old-fashioned way. Just old-fashioned, like I myself tend to wear a trilby hat, which was common in the 50s, but looks quite anachronistic now, but I just like wearing it. Or, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some other things. Having outdated views of how society is presently constituted, never mind historically. But the more interesting idea of anachronism is when you read into a past age ideas or obsessions or attitudes which were not around then, which belong to our age, or at least to a future age. This can make for very lively, very amusing comedy on TV. The most obvious one is Rowan Atkinson's Blackadder, where Atkinson is pretending to be an Elizabethan courtier, say, and he keeps this up for a while, then he suddenly turns round and talks exactly like an educated, rather waspish man of the 1980s. That sort of business. But it's done seriously by historians at times. Unconsciously, they read things back into the past which weren't there, and that is a besetting sin. There's a more sophisticated view. We tend to also look at the aspects of the past which appeal to our age. To go through this very quickly, the 19th century was concerned with state building. This comes from the German historians who admired the Prussian state originally, but it spread to England. There'd been a state in England longer than there had been. The state of Prussia was rather new. but there'd been a Kingdom of England, now Kingdom of Great Britain, for rather longer, certainly Kingdom of England, so you didn't have to worry so much perhaps about the creation of the kingdom in the first place. But historians of the 19th century were very interested in the development of representative institutions, because that was happening in the 19th century. The Great Reform Bill of 1832, the second one of 1867, more and more people getting the vote, the final fate of the power of the monarchy. So when they looked at the past, they tended to focus immensely on the growth of Parliament, going back to the late 13th century. And the Civil War was a real sacred period, as it was still when I was an undergraduate, the idea that you finally defeat a would-be absolutist king, and Charles I, you cut his head off, in fact, and because of that, you secure the principle of representation, not democracy, but at least constitutional government, the answerability of the executive to Parliament. You manage to secure it in Britain for all times. And then it gradually develops between the 1680s and on into the 20th century, getting constitutional government becomes, goes from strength to strength, although with checks on the way. Combined with that was a focus on the activities of great men. There are other inputs, of course, the development of the British Empire, that was looked at. So you focus on kings, politicians, prime ministers, etc., generals, etc. They're the people who do things. The mass of the people, what you call social history, economic history, they're just there to be ruled. In some ways, there is a point in that, in a way. Someone who takes that view could say that, well, there wasn't any democracy much before 1800, so whatever the mass of the people thought, it wasn't too relevant. They were just given orders, so it makes sense to concentrate on the 5% of the elite who had real power and real wealth. We aren't living in the age that we have now, where everyone has a vote. So it may be wrong-headed to be too obsessed with what the mass of 17th century peasants thought or did or something. I don't think anyone would quite take that attitude now. But anyway, great deeds, great men, the development of the state, the development of Parliament and the Constitution, which you can reach back even to the idea of the Anglo-Saxon Witan, which 19th century historians thought was some sort of proto-parliament. A lot of that is encapsulated in the Whig interpretation of history. By the time you get to the young Christopher Hill in the 1930s, you have the Marxist or economic interpretation of history, whereby the specific events of actors on the stage, Cromwell, Charles I, William, John Pym, for example, are considered in a way less important than the socio-economic forces behind them, that they are spokesmen for very considerable socio-economic interests. They don't just get up in the morning and say, oh, well, I think I'll be an absolute monarch today. Or, I think I'll have a revolution today. I'll send my servants round to ask a few of the lads to meet me down the tavern and we'll plot a revolution. It isn't like that. These are great seismic events. Able individuals get thrown up, like Cromwell or Pym, because you need people who can lead these things, or Lord Fairfax, for a long time, Cromwell's superior army commander, a forgotten figure. Figures who are not so able, but have inherited their position, like Charles I. Charles I was a very cultured gentleman, connoisseur of the arts, not so good as a politician. Figures who are not so able mismanage events and get themselves into this situation where they fail to avoid an earthquake. So individuals do count, but basically you're going to have the earthquake, the eruption of Vesuvius, the eruption of Mount Etna. Anyway, another figure who gets, of course, very caught up and doesn't know what to do about it is the hapless, another king who lost his head, Louis the 16th of France. And then again, the ultimate Marxist revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. The Tsar, look what happens to the Tsar and his family. But individuals don't count for so much, although the communists tended to contradict that by giving canonization to Lenin and then for a time to Stalin, but that's a bit of a contradiction. In the Marxist interpretation, it's great socio-economic attitudes, movements. But then, in the 1950s and 60s, as a reaction against this, the Marxist interpretation is all down to economic change. So change in economy, combined with change in technology, produces new social classes. They demand their place in the sun. because they've got their power, so the old order must be in place to new. There is something in that. There is something in the Whig interpretation. But by the early 1960s, Lawrence Stone, in his Decline of the Aristocracy, the English aristocracy in the 17th century, by the way, referred to all this as the clumsy old Marxist bulldozer. He obviously thought Marxism was destructive and very unsubtle, and that something which said explained everything by economics explained little. So you look then on social and psychological factors. You also, now history is terribly variant, but I would say one dominant theme is more sociological than simply Marxist economics. I myself like that. I find it very useful. I've looked, of course, at present-day economics. I'm no authority on it, but I've often discovered that present-day sociologists studying the present day often take 5 years and $100,000 or something to tell you there's a pawn shop on the corner, which you knew all the time, and you know why people go there, because they need to pawn things. This isn't always the case. Sometimes sociologists get rid of received values or received ideas about how certain groups of people think, i.e. that all teachers are raving lefties or something, which just isn't true. But I do find that if you take sociological and to some degree anthropological techniques and put them back, ask the same questions that a sociologist would ask of us or someone else living today, put them back 300 years and ask those questions as far as you can, then it can be extremely useful, much more illuminating. Greater emphasis is given today to the mind in history, whereas a Marxist might say that religious values or other conceptions that people are claiming, in the Civil War, people claimed they were fighting about religion, Puritanism versus High Anglicanism or whatever. A Marxist in 1930 said, they might have believed it, but I'm not sure whether all of them even believed it. It was just a cover for their economic ambitions. We don't believe that now. We don't think that 17th century people were just totally rational, homo economicus, economic man, if you like, who were just saying, well, I want to make more money, I want to secure my property, but I have to use religious language to do it. They genuinely integrated the religious outlook with their other conceptions, and if you try and put economic motives over there and religious motives over there, you're really behaving not like a 17th century person, but like us, where we have a tendency, it's a good thing in a way, it leads to greater tolerance, to say that whatever a person's religion is, whether he's a Quaker, a Buddhist, or Roman Catholic, that's his private affair, rather like his sex life. While when we're at work, when we're doing business, etc., we focus on business or politics, economics, and religion has nothing to do with it. Well, 17th or 16th century people just didn't think like that. But there's a tendency for Marxist historians early in this century to make them think like that. History now, and the approach to history, has become more complicated than ever, because although I've been rather facilely knocking, say, the Marxist interpretation, the Whig interpretation, quite a lot of it is valuable. What is not valuable is to force everything into that corset, everything into constitutional development, as the great Victorian historian Thomas Macaulay did, everything into a sophisticated Marxist interpretations the young Christopher Hill, who's still with us, did. But certain of what their insights are obviously still valid. And then we've added everything else. We've borrowed techniques from sociology, anthropology. We've restored the role of religion, mentalité, that what people think, what people say are their values, you should believe them, really. They're probably being quite sincere when they say, I'm dying for the Protestant/Catholic religion. That's what they mean. It's not just an outcrop of social or economic change. Okay, that could feed into it. So really, historiography, the approach to history, and the tools you use, the analytical tools, have become more complicated than ever. It's rather difficult to deal with them all. One longs for the time when history, sometimes one longs sneakingly, for the time when history was simply past politics and constitutional development, and you could ignore the attitudes and mentalities of the average person. At least it made life simpler. But there are, of course, political and constitutional historians around today. But can they go back to the model of Macaulay or 19th century people, no, they can't. They have to put their politics and constitutional development in a framework of the social attitudes and the mentalities of the time. You know, they have to take, they have to put in the social, indeed sociological dimension themselves. This is a great advance because, although I did well at history at A-level in school, I used to ask questions sometimes. What was the difference? Sometimes, the way it was presented, we did Charles I and Cromwell, they were presented a bit like people of the 1960s in fancy dress. We didn't really get the idea of differentness, the differentness of outlook, the difference of mentality enough. We got it a bit, but not enough. You know, that they were taking political decisions as a contemporary politician might. And I got more of the sociological history from doing A-level English, social history, sorry, and reading Shakespeare, and the notes at the back, the editions at the back, used to talk about how great Elizabethan aristocrats would entertain 300 people in their houses to barons of beef and have lots of clients and hangers-on as servants. I used to say, this is fascinating, I'd like to investigate this sort of history. But ironically, it was put on as editorial notes to Shakespeare in those days. Of course, a year or so later, Lawrence Stone's seminal work, The Decline of the Aristocracy, actually dealt with that sort of thing, the structure of the aristocracy and how they lived. And that has, you know, given a huge boost to that whole area of history, how people lived. It needn't be the aristocracy, but, you know, how people lived and their mentalities, everything like that.